This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I'm joined once again by the wonderful Jill Bucaro, who is joining us all the way from just outside Yellowstone Park today. You're in your traveling school bus right now, going around the United States. Everything good with you, Jill?
Everything's great. We're having a blast. 6 weeks it was on Saturday that we've been on the road.
Fantastic. I'm very
Yeah,
envious of your travels. So, thank you for joining us again at
of
Good Food
course.
Revolution. We are here today to speak about meat substitutes. And I guess the kind of growth of meat substitutes over the last couple of decades. When it comes to meat substitutes, what are your thoughts?
So you're right in that it has increased.
Yes.
The global meat substitutes market was valued at almost $5.5 billion in 2020, and it's expected to at least double by 2030. But some have estimated it will tenfold increase. So it is definitely on the rise. 2/3 of Americans say they've tried meat alternatives. And a survey found 28% of the people that had tried plant alternatives tried them for the first time in the past year. So it's
Interesting.
really making kind of a growth and a leap. And I think too, as opposed to like the garden burgers of the past or the Boca burgers, which were marketed towards vegetarians and vegans,
Yes.
the current meat alternatives are aimed at meat eaters, which is just a bigger percentage of the population. So the marketing's going towards a larger group of people. So yes, it's definitely been increasing, and looks like it's going to continue to increase over the
Now,
next several years.
now you follow a plant-based diet. When
Mhm.
did you shift over to a plant-based diet, and what was your first introduction to meat substitutes?
So let's see. It's been about, my son is 12, so about 13 years I went
Right.
to vegetarian. And I really did it for health reasons. I had read a book called Eat to Live by Dr. Joel Furman, and I just thought I would give it a try to eat
Mhm.
more fruits and vegetables. And I didn't really do a lot of the imitation meats. I really just did a lot of like fruits and vegetables or whole grains or beans and legumes. Um, and I felt great on it. So I was like, oh, I'm going to just kind of keep doing this. And so I used the imitation or the alternatives as kind of like a bridge or to kind of, meet that nostalgia that I had for a burger or, chicken or whatever the case might be.
Yes.
So I kind of used it as the, you know, once in a while kind of stuff. But again, this is 12, 13 years ago. It wasn't what it is now. I mean, you really
Right.
had to like, have like a cardboardy kind of burger. So it's like it wasn't hard to stay away from them because they weren't that tasty. And now as it's grown, in popularity and just the options and what they're making it out of, soy is still the primary
Yes.
like key ingredient, but it's mushrooms and jackfruit and beans and peas and gluten, wheat based. I mean, there's a zillion like different plant based things. So it's become easier to have them because they're tastier, more enjoyable.
In doing some research for today's chat, I discovered that the history of imitation meat goes back quite some way. The Chinese are way ahead of us when it comes to this, simply because of the Buddhist cooks there, who for a hell of a long time have been making roast duck, roast goose, even intestines out of wheat gluten and tofu
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. And then I was finding out that all across Russia, there are ancient recipes for making caviar out of aubergine, eggplant, and
Mm-hmm.
also closer to home for me in Wales, there's a thing called the Glamorgan sausage, which is an ersatz sausage made of cheese, breadcrumbs, and leeks, which was particularly popular, I believe, during the Second World War and after, when people were on rationing, for example. So
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely this connection to imitation meat that comes through both faith and also people, well, vegetarians, and people being unable to afford meat at some point.
Yeah, there are many reasons why people would be led to try these plant-based alternatives. And like you said, the ethical reasons back to, dating back to Buddhism,
Yeah.
people just in general wanting to avoid animal products that come from factory farming, because we're learning more and more that the practices are pretty darn cruel. And actually, COVID brought a lot of that to light. It had an impact because crowded and potentially unsafe animal practices we were exposed to that, where maybe we had never really thought about that before, and how we're raising our animals. Yeah, in fact, 90% of vegans cite animal welfare as the reason they made the decision to go vegan.
Right.
So that would, be that. But environmental reasons are big. Maybe a doctor recommended they eat less meat, general health reasons. In a survey, 90% of customers purchasing meat alternatives are meat eaters who believe the products are more healthful and better for the environment. And then, kind of like I mentioned before, they've come a long way in taste. So somebody who maybe would be reluctant to try it 10 years ago would be introduced to it today and be like, oh, this actually tastes delicious. So I think there's tons of reasons. And then to your point too, the financial, it's really just like an individual reason as to why you might try.
I was just reading a recent study by Maple Leaf Foods, who are one of their kind of big food in Canada. And they own, is it Light Life? They have a brand of meat substitutes. And they've actually seen quite a serious decline in the first quarter of this year. Quite substantial. I think it's about 13-14% in their meat substitute lines. And what they've seen, and I thought this was interesting, was they've seen their trial rate is incredibly high. You mentioned there that a very high percentage of people will be willing to try it, but they're not finding the repeat purchases happening. And they put that down to two things. One of them being that they think that it's still underperforming with regards to taste and flavor, but also financially, it's not much cheaper than meat right now for a lot of these meat substitutes.
No, you're right. I think plants can be cheaper than meat. Like you said, it's breadcrumbs, right? Leeks and what, to make something like that. That can definitely be a less expensive alternative to meat. But the meat alternatives, you're right, they're not always less expensive. In fact, sometimes they can be more. And that depends too. Now, are you comparing it to conventionally raised, meat that is on sale at a big supermarket, or are you comparing it to like a grass-fed, meat that would likely not be under what a meat substitute would be? But yeah, if you're in a shopping, a grocery store and you're kind of price comparing, it's not always less expensive to get those like meat alternatives, depending on which ones they are.
And meat alternatives are not always healthier, are they?
Ah, that's correct. Ingredient label reading here is so key, because not all meat alternatives are made equal. So some general comparisons, the plant-based options usually don't have any cholesterol. They tend to have more fiber, and depending on the source, they have less saturated fat. But they also can tend to have more sodium, more sugar, more refined oils, and then things like preservatives and stabilizers and thickeners. So it depends again on like what you're comparing, and you really have to be specific. Like, are you comparing it to a bowl of kale, or are you comparing it to a Big Mac, right? Like, and are you, comparing what plant-based meat alternative and what's the base? The majority, as I mentioned, is still soy-based. Wheat is also used a lot in the substitutes, and a lot of these can be made, from GMO ingredients, which is not ideal. But then some are from mushrooms and jackfruit and beans, and which can be really wonderful and great sources of protein and fiber. So there's, again, it's really individual. It's so hard to put things in categories because it's so dependent on the individual company, food source, all of that stuff.
I was looking at the two sort of biggest companies in North America, so Beyond Meat and Impossible, the Impossible Burger, and looking at the list of ingredients for those products. And I've enjoyed, I don't eat fast food, but I do actually have the Beyond Meat burger from A&W now and again. because somebody told me it was good. I tried it. I thought, hey, that's actually not so bad. But then looking at the list of ingredients, I was shocked. And a lot of these meat substitutes are actually often just as processed as many of the processed meat products we see on the shelves.
They're very processed. Beyond is based in pea protein, and they use no genetically modified ingredients, no soy, no gluten. So, that can be a benefit if that's what you're looking for. Now, the Impossible is a soy based, and they have made no claims that they use non-genetically modified, so again, depending on what you're looking for, but you're absolutely right. The list of ingredients for some of these, plant-based products are a mile long, and a lot of stuff you can't pronounce, and a lot of things we're not really sure about. And I think in that case, having like pasture-raised chicken breasts or having that grass-fed beef, if you're looking at it from a health perspective, is probably a better option. It's definitely cleaner, and it's definitely, again, closer to what nature has provided us, so nature has provided us animals and plants and fish. And so I always go back to that. And so is this, Beyond Burger, is this Impossible Burger like made, with plants? Yes. But is the totality of the product something that our body recognizes?
Yeah.
Not really.
As someone on a plant-based diet, how do you feel about that drive to create a meat substitute that oozes blood and all of that sort of stuff? I find that kind of doppelganger thing they're trying intriguing, to say the least. I mean, I don't look for a plant-based burger that drips blood myself, but I find it quite fascinating, the whole concept of them, using all of this technology, food science, to create these things that look, ostensibly taste and smell just like the real thing.
Yeah. A lot of meat eaters will make fun of non-meat eaters. They're like, why do you make your food look like meat? You don't want it to be. But again, I think that goes back to those companies have specifically said their marketing is towards meat eaters.
Yes.
So they want to introduce, right? So that's the person who eats burgers, regularly. Hey, why don't you try this burger? It bleeds, it's got the texture, it's got the flavor, it sizzles, it drips grease, it's all that stuff that you want in your burger, but it's made from plants. So that's what I would say to that, because a lot of vegetarians and vegans do not like that. That's why one of the reasons they went away from it is like, I don't want to even think that I'm eating meat. I don't want it to look like meat. And so it's split, I would say, on like the vegetarian vegan side of things as to whether that's something that's appealing,
Being an old cultural studies student, I start thinking semantically about the word meat and what that actually means to people. Is it a profile of nutrients that people are looking for when they speak of meat? Or is it texture and flavor? I wasn't asking you to give me a definitive answer to that, but just it's what goes through my head when I think, well, what are people looking for when they speak about meat?
Yeah, I don't know that they know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you were raised eating chicken and burgers, I mean, I didn't think about it. I thought about it as a source of protein. I would say maybe once I got into like my college and, like early 20s, because I learned about macronutrients, right? And you learn about like fat and carbohydrates and protein. So I think that, a lot of us identify meat as a source of protein. And maybe that's it. And then we're used to the texture and the flavor, and that's what recipes we have. Like that's what our parents, our grandparents, that's what we grew up eating. And so, when people do want to switch to being more plant-based and they're like, I just don't know where to start. It took me years to really get like a regular arsenal of these easy go-to, veggie meat-free meals. And I just say like, if somebody told me that tomorrow I had to eat all Indian food, I'd be in real trouble because I only know how to make like 2 or 3 things. So it's just like anything else, like if that's what you're used to making a totally kind of different style of, meal, it takes some time. So I would say like they identify it with like protein, if from a health standpoint, and then from, that's what we're raised with. Most people are raised eating meat. So it's just kind of like, don't even think about it.
You mentioned earlier the environmental impact of eating meat versus eating many of these meat substitutes. Would you mind expanding upon that a little?
Yeah, so it's been shown in general that the plant-based alternatives use less things like land
Yep.
than conventionally raised meat. They emit less greenhouse gases and they use less water. So the thought I think behind it too is that instead of growing a ton of crops to feed animals, why don't we just use that land to grow crops for like direct
Yeah.
consumption? Because to produce a calorie of food from animals, on average, it takes 10 calories of feed, like, needed in the form of feed. So the ratio is not very good. And that can vary. It can be, 4 calories to 25 calories,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
you're putting into an animal to get a calorie of food out. So I think that's where their environmental, angle comes from. But again, this is compared to conventionally raised meat. So now there's grass fed or pasture raised animals that can be really beneficial to the environment. It's all part of the cycle. So that's what I would say about the environmental aspect as far as being, positive. But on the other side, there's some crops, that are used for the plant, based alternatives like soy and wheat that typically come from monocrops, which are
Yes. Yeah.
terrible for the soil, and therefore the environment. And unless they're organic, which a lot of them are not, they're sprayed with pesticides and herbicides like glyphosate, which have a ton of health implications for the human body and
Yeah.
the environment. So again, I really, painting with a broad brush doesn't work here because are you talking about, factory raised cattle, or are you talking about a grass fed, animal? Are you talking about, the monocrop GMO soy and wheat, or something a little bit more healthful?
Lots of food for thought there for sure. In closing, Jill, what would Wellness Riot advise with regards to best practices when it comes to the consumption of meat substitutes?
So I think the biggest thing, like I've said a couple times, is don't paint with a broad brush. So
Mhm.
don't put yourself in one category or the other. And I would say ask yourself, why are you looking to a plant-based alternative? And then just check to make sure that's true. If you think you're doing it for environmental reasons, check that to make sure that's actually true. If you're doing it for health
Yes.
reasons, check that to make sure that's actually true. Again, you can use it as a bridge if you're trying to consume less meat. I wouldn't make it an everyday thing. Reading it, labels again is really important. And I would say, when do an internet search for clean meat alternatives or the
Yes.
best tasting, plant-based burgers, based on, kind of again going back to that question, why are you eating it in the first place?
Would you be open to suggesting a couple of brands that people could look for that you have found great success with yourself?
So there's so many companies and there's so many brands and there's so many options. I would say the key is really to look for the ingredients. So
Right.
things that are made from like beans, legumes, mushrooms are great. Jackfruit is a really great option too. My advice is always to go organic if you can, because again, it's going to be non-GMO. It's going to mean, not sprayed, with all the pesticides. And if you're going for the health aspect, you don't want all that in your food anyway. So I would say more ingredient label and keeping it to few ingredients. So, the less ingredients, the better. It should be whatever it is, make the meat out of, and then maybe a few flavorings and things like that. So I think as opposed to brands, it would just be like looking at the ingredients.
I always find the majority of these meat substitutes to be very, very salty. And in reading, I've discovered that a lot of them do have a very high salt content.
Yeah. Yep. I would definitely check sodium. I would also check sugar if it's
Yep.
something is surprising. You're not going to find sugar in a chicken breast or a steak, but you might find it in like an imitation like chicken
Yep.
fillet or something like that. So sugar, sodium, and oils. Refined oils is a big one too to kind of avoid, like the safflower, soybean, canola. They sneak their way into those plant alternatives a lot.
All right. Well, I'm going to try and do some plant-based alternative cooking this evening. I'll let you know how it goes. Thank you very much for joining us at Good Food Revolution once again, and safe travels.
Thank you.
Bye for now.